a real pleasure to be able to have a discussion and a talk with two of our own today. We have really two of the most important voices on what's going on in the Middle East, on thinking through questions of terrorism, thinking about what kind of a lens America should look through in looking at this region. And to my right is a Pulitzer Prize-winning author. Of course, many of you know him as Washington correspondent for the New Yorker magazine, former managing editor of the Washington Post. He won the Pulitzer Prize for Ghost Wars, The Secret History of the CIA, Afghanistan and Bin Laden. Afghanistan and Bin Laden. The Secret History of the CIA, Afghanistan and Bin Laden from the Soviet Invasion. Was Bin Laden in the title?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't realize. Excuse me. I thought that was an error. Okay, but Ghost Wars. And Steve, of course, is our president and CEO here of the New America Foundation, and is also co-director of our new terrorism initiative here within my program, within the American Strategy Program. To his right, we have Peter Bergen. Peter is a terrorism analyst for CNN, the author of Holy War, Inc., the Bin Laden I Know as well, two very, very important books on which much of Steve's new book, The Bin Ladens, An Arabian Family in the American Century, which is already a bestseller and all of the big lists. And Steve is happy after this to sign some books to those of you who'd like to have them. We've arranged for Politics and Prose to have the books out there today. And I think that this book, of course, I'm biased, and I'm saying this because my boss here also runs a good chance of winning awards. Right, Steve? And well, what we're going to do is have Steve share some thoughts about his book. Peter Bergen is going to offer some comments, and then I'll help moderate a discussion and Q&A afterwards. So without further ado, please welcome Steve Coll.
Thank you very much, Steve, and thank you all for coming on a day when it's not an obvious inside day, but I'm particularly pleased to be here with Peter, who has really become a good friend and also whose work was indispensable to the creation of this book, as the acknowledgments and the footnotes make clear. I think Peter is the preeminent biographer of Osama, and knowing that he was out there working on his oral history actually shaped the way I researched this book, figuring that he would cover all of that ground and then I would derive the benefit of that work. And so I do see this book as very much rooted in Peter's own work, so particularly glad to be sharing this hour with him. I'll just talk for 15 or 20 minutes about where this book came from and what its purpose was as I got started, and then perhaps try to give you a little bit of a flavor of the narrative in the hope that it will orient you to the book that you'll then read. But as Steve said, this book really followed on Ghost Wars in a sort of organic way. In Ghost Wars, I had tried to write about the antecedents of 9/11 as they were located in 20 years of U.S. foreign and intelligence policy in Afghanistan. And to some extent, I had treated Osama bin Laden as a creature of the international Islamist radical movements after 1979, and to some extent to an even greater extent, I had treated him as a creature of the Afghan wars in that narrative. And I had described a little bit of his relationship with Saudi intelligence and in his relations with the rest of the royal family, but I really felt as I came out of that book that I had kind of bounced off Saudi Arabia. Even though I came and went to the kingdom, I felt there was more complexity and more nuance about Osama's origins there, but even more broadly the generation to which he belonged, that I had simply been unable to bring forward to a general readership and wanted to do more reporting about. So as a younger person, I had consumed a lot of books with titles like the Roosevelts or the Kennedys or the Rockefellers, these kind of multi-generational family narratives that illuminated eras of political or economic history. And it was only a couple of months after Ghost Wars that I was taking a walk one day and thought, the Bin Ladens, a framework for a similar undertaking. And my goal actually from the beginning and throughout the project had not so much to do with Osama. What I wanted to write about was Saudi Arabia and its experience of modernization, first of all, and to try to explore that subject through the narrative of the Bin Laden family over 100 years in all of its diversity and across all of that time. And through that prism, illuminate something fresh and specific and authentic about the Saudi royal family and the privileged elites that grew up around the royal family, particularly after the Second World War. And to try, secondly, to describe some of the diversity of experience that the generation that Osama belonged to endured after the oil boom of the 1970s and 1980s. This was a generation that experienced sudden wealth and was particularly disoriented about what that wealth might purchase by way of identity and experience in a rapidly modernizing kingdom. And I thought that the generation to which Osama belonged offered a way to describe in sort of specific and accessible terms what the diversity of experiences felt like and consisted of. And then finally, I wanted to write about globalization in the Middle East through this family, because the Bin Ladens in the end are a Saudi family only up to a point. Their origins in Yemen and their own purchase on global business and on the mobility of that modernization provided to elites like the Bin Ladens meant that they were always a global family as much as a Saudi family. And I think that is very much present in Osama's identity as the leader of al-Qaeda and as a terrorist, and trying to describe what that experience of globalization felt like from the point of view of a generation coming of age in the kingdom, but also what happened when you carried this identity out into Europe and the West or to the rest of the Arab world, is part of what this story is all about. So that was the frame. The narrative covers 100 years and many characters and events, and it's difficult to summarize in 10 minutes, but I'll try to give you a taste of three of the principal characters through whom the story is told. First, Osama's father, Mohammad, who created the fortune. Second, his eldest brother, Salam, who ran the family for 20 critical years as Osama grew up between the ages of about 10 and 30. During that period of Osama's life, the family was run by his eldest brother, Salam. And then finally, I'll conclude with a couple of thoughts about Osama himself. I did want, by the way, to reinterpret Osama in this book. That was another of my purposes, I would say, the third in the order of priorities that I had. I wanted to reinterpret him as a member of his own family and as a Saudi dissident, because I just felt that as a complement to other interpretations, which I and others had offered in the past, that there was a way in which his identity as a Bin Laden and his politics as a Saudi dissident, particularly in the 1990s, filled out some of this picture. That was my hypothesis, certainly as I began to write. So Mohammed bin Laden, there's in these three characters, Mohammed, Salam, and Osama, there is, I think, a streak of charismatic genius that originates with the father and is, in effect, passed to his son Salam, who is a very westernized character. And it takes expression in Salam's life in a very peculiar and, to Americans, to some extent, familiar form. And I think this streak of intuition and even genius is present in some of Osama's talent as well, though in a very refracted and distorted way and applied, obviously, to very different ends. And I think that some of the narrative tracks this sort of energy because it is an unusually talented group. Not every bin Laden, but these three in particular, and some others as well. I mean, Mohammed bin Laden was essentially an orphan who was born in a famine-stricken canyon in southern Yemen in the Hadramaut and who walked out with his brother Abdullah. They belong to a very self-conscious international diaspora. The Hadramis are well known in the Islamic world for their global achievements in the pre-colonial and colonial period, less well known in the West, but they bear characteristics similar to the overseas Chinese and the Jewish diasporas that are best known in our own cultural histories. But they were achievers and very self-conscious, so it wasn't entirely in a vacuum that Mohammed and Abdullah at about 14 made this migration. In fact, they were connected through this Hadrami diaspora with support that they could rely upon through their identity. But they turned up in Saudi Arabia and Jeddah just in time for the Great Depression, and it took about 15 years for Mohammed to really get himself organized. He hustled at first, slept on the ground, taught himself to be a mason, a bricklayer, started a small contracting company, connected with Aramco for a while, started to build himself up. And when the Second World War ended, he was positioned to capitalize on the oil wealth that now, for the first time, really began to flow into Saudi Arabia because the disruptions of the Depression and the disruptions to sea commerce during the Second World War had deprived the royal family of their own wealth for about 15 years. And when it came in as all of a sudden, and the Al Saud, the Saudi royal family, reacted to it the way lottery winners in our own society sometimes react to sudden wealth. They sort of overinterpreted the significance of this money and started spending it rather garishly on themselves. And so the first wave of expenditure in Saudi Arabia between 1945 and the early 1950s was dominated by palace building rather than national infrastructure development. And Mohammed bin Laden had this great intuition about how to ingratiate himself with the Saudi royal family and make himself their favored palace builder. The Al Saud, encouraged by the United States, invited in international contracting corporations like Bechtel and others to start to build Saudi Arabia. But these companies found that the idiosyncrasies of working with the Saudi royal family were considerable. So they would start out on a project building something sensible like a road between Jeddah and Mecca to speed pilgrims to the Hajj. And the third week on the job, after they'd imported their managers and their engineers and their bulldozers and their graders, somebody would come from a nearby palace with a message, which was, His Royal Highness's refrigerator is broken. Can you send someone over to repair it? And then 2 weeks later, the message would come over, His Royal Highness would like to borrow your bulldozer because he wants to dig a swimming pool behind his palace. And it went on and on, like payments were late. Barter was a common offer from the Saudi royals, trading chicken farms for palaces. And at a certain point, Bechtel and German and British counterparts just concluded that life was too short to work in Saudi Arabia and that they could make more money elsewhere in the region. And as they packed up and left, and you see this again and again in the archives describing this in great detail, Mohammed bin Laden was always there at the port waving them good luck and turning to the royal family in effect to say, I'm here to finish the job. And it was this gift that he had for working as a kind of flexible concierge service to the Saudi royal family on the one hand, and at the same time organizing around him an extraordinarily diverse workforce and a very talented company that included engineers from Italy and accountants from the United States. As early as 1952, he had agents on Broadway in New York sending him the very best equipment and all sorts of other consumer goods from the United States. And gradually from this beginning, he built himself up until he became, by the mid-1960s, the sort of Halliburton of Saudi Arabia in the sense that he had won the confidence of generations of rulers in the Saudi royal family who knew that he was discreet, able to work on no-bid contracts on sensitive defense and intelligence projects such as building defense infrastructure along the Yemen border where none had previously existed, and that he was reliable. He was illiterate. He had a single eye. he had no formal training, but he had a gift for intuitively deciphering how to solve complex engineering projects, and also, even more, a gift for leading diverse workers in harsh conditions. As he built up this fortune, he was also privileged from the early 1950s by the royal family as the only authorized contractor of the three holy cities of Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem. In the course of this research, my researcher Robin Schulman and myself discovered all of the bid documents from his work in Jerusalem from the late 1950s and 1960s, really remarkable trove of materials describing the depth and sustained nature of his involvement in renovation work on the site of the Dome of the Rock and the surrounding sanctuaries. And he also owned a house in East Jerusalem, as it turned out, which was seized by Israeli land authorities after the 1967 war. And so it turned out that in a technical and legal sense, at least, the Bin Laden family has a claim of property return that at least puts itself into the same position as many Palestinians. Obviously, they're Saudis, very wealthy in Jeddah, but nonetheless, they did lose property. There's much else to say about Mohammad, but I want to move quickly. So I'll just observe something about his passing, which occurred in September 1967. He had, inspired by the example of the Saudi royal family, married often. He'd had 54 children by about 22 wives, 25 sons and 29 daughters. Now, this was actually a fairly modest achievement in comparison to King Saud, for example, who had, I think, 200 children, or Abdulaziz, who has about 45 acknowledged sons and about 100 children of his own. In Mohammed bin Laden's case, he had two senior wives to whom he remained married for fairly long periods of time, as best the records show, and then two more wives, as permitted by Islamic law, that he married and divorced serially. But whenever one of these wives became pregnant, he fully enfranchised her as a legitimate wife, and the child, whether son or daughter, as a legitimate heir. And that was the circumstances in which Osama was born. I came to understand that his circumstances as a single child of a relatively short-term wife was actually a fairly common condition among the sons of Mohammed bin Laden. There were at least a dozen or 15 other singleton children that I could identify, and they were all treated as fully enfranchised and fully legitimate. We can come back to the circumstances of Osama's childhood later if you're interested. But in September of 1967, Mohammed bin Laden was flying to one of his work sites on the Yemen border with his American pilot at the helm in a twin-engine Beech aircraft. He was the first private Saudi to own airplanes outside the royal family in Saudi Arabia. He had a jet as well as a number of propeller aircraft. And this pilot, veteran of the American Air Force, was attempting to land at a makeshift desert strip marked by rocks in a bowl. And as he came in for the approach, a crosswind blew, and he miscalculated his angle of descent, tried to pull up and go around, miscalculated again, stalled at about 750 feet above the desert, fell, crashed, and burned. And Mohammed bin Laden and the pilot and everyone else aboard died in the fire. At the time of his death in September 1967, Mohammed's eldest son, Salam, was perhaps 22 or 23 years old, and he was attending boarding school in England, where he was playing in a rock and roll band called the Echoes. His bandmates included someone who would go on to marry the country singer Emmylou Harris. Salam had a little sports car that he kept outside his boarding school called Copford Glebe, which he and his friends would take into London, despite the school's rules against such things. And Salam came home from that school to try to lead the family with no real training, but with some of his father's charisma that proved to be a source of considerable success over the next 20 years as he led the family. Salam is difficult to describe. He is a sort of larger-than-life character. As a researcher, once I thought there would be contrasts in the lifestyles of the bin Ladens, but I had no idea about Salam when I really began, and he was, from a researcher's point of view, the gift that just kept on giving the more I reported. He was a rock and roll enthusiast, a pilot, an adventurer, a traveler, a businessman. He loved to perform and to sing. At his English boarding schools, he had been drawn, of course, into the choir, which he referred to as the group sing, and there he had acquired an enthusiasm for performance that never left him. He traveled with a briefcase with about $250,000 in cash in it, and when he found himself in front of any stage, at a wedding or a nightclub or Oktoberfest in Germany, an Academy Awards party, he would unfold the briefcase, take out a few $100s, pay the band leader for access to the stage during the next break, get up there, and typically his repertoire began with House of the Rising Sun in 7 languages. He also sang a lot of folk songs. If he were here now, he would leave everybody in On Top of Old Smoky, or She'll Be Coming Round the Mountain When She Comes. At Oktoberfest once in Germany, he bought his way onto the stage and led 700 drunk Munichers, I don't know what you call Munichers, but people from Munich, in German folk songs that he had just memorized on the flight in from Paris, but he managed to get everybody singing them. And he used this way of living to equalize his negotiations with chief executives of Fortune 1000 companies with whom the Bin Ladens were now often partners in business. And these were accomplished men, Porsche, General Electric, Volvo, many other companies. And he was often negotiating business deals with men in their 50s with vast experience. Here he was in his 30s. And so he used his personality to try to level the playing field. So, for instance, he would only negotiate about business matters while lying in bed. And he would call the CEOs to his bedroom, either in the hotel or at home. And he's fully clothed, but lying there watching television and then having them sit at the foot of the bed. But he would also bring them into meetings such as the one attended by the CEO of Bell Canada, who came to Jeddah to negotiate what was then the largest telecommunications contract that Bell Canada ever had outside of Canada. And at the climactic event, he invited the CEO to his house, and he was expecting a business meeting, and instead Salam had organized a big party where he had the CEO lead a long session of Frère Jacques in French, and then only afterwards negotiated with him. Salam had an estate outside of Disney World. At one point, fearing revolution in Saudi Arabia, he bought plots of land for all of his brothers and sisters, named each of them after a flower, and decided that they would build a refuge for the Bin Laden family next to Disney World, where they could all find another magical kingdom after the one in Saudi Arabia collapsed. And he had a place in Texas, an apartment in Manhattan. He loved to buy electronics on 47th Street in New York, because he prided himself, after he understood at a certain point how things worked, on never paying retail. And he would fill his Bach 111 with hundreds and hundreds of the latest electronic gadgets and ship them back to Saudi Arabia to hand out to the princes. That was the way he curried favor with the royal family. Anyway, he was very successful. And what's remarkable about him is that he collaborated very actively with Osama during all of this time in the 1980s. He traveled to Pakistan to provide Osama with support, cash, publicity, made videotapes of Osama on the Afghan frontier, and he'd often arrive with this completely shaggy entourage of his pilots and mechanics and rock and roll musicians. Basically, if you wanted to travel with Salam, you had to play an instrument, and then you had to also be able to fly a plane. And so he had all these pilots who played drums or guitar or bass who flew around with him, and he would just bring them to meet Osama on these missions to the frontier. And I think, like Peter, I'd often wondered what Americans besides Peter Osama had ever met. There's a clear record, I think, to date, that he never dealt directly with CIA officers in the field, for instance. So he didn't have meetings with American serving officers wearing tennis shoes. His proximity to CIA support for the Afghan Mujahideen was considerable, so in a political military sense, the fact that he didn't actually deal directly with CIA officers probably doesn't make a lot of difference, but it's always been a specific question. What Americans did he ever meet? Well, it turned out that he met various ultralight aircraft salesmen and mechanics and others from San Antonio who flew up with Salam to meet Osama for the purposes of passing money to him or checking in with him and seeing what he needed. There's this great scene where Salam invites Osama to a luxury hotel in London in 1986 in order to arrange the sale of surface-to-air missiles to him. And Salam shows up at the meeting with his sort of hippie-ish German and Swedish friends, and they're going into the suite where Osama's waiting to negotiate with the arms broker, and Salam turns to his friends and says, oh, I forgot to tell you, my brother, he's really, really religious. So everybody, no jokes, put your cigarettes out, and we'll be out of here in 45 minutes. And that was the nature of the relationship. It was a very close one. Salam, in May 1988, attended the wedding of a son of one of his American pilots in San Antonio, Texas. At the Saturday wedding, he sang his usual repertoire of songs and led the group in various folk singing. And the next morning on Sunday after the wedding, he woke up with nothing to do, called his pilot friends. They said, oh, let's go fly ultralights and kill some time, have some breakfast. They went out to an ultralight recreational park outside of San Antonio called Kitty Hawk Field of Dreams. And in a freak accident, Salam got into an ultralight, clear day, light winds, took off about 500 feet and leveled out. This is a guy with thousands of hours of experience flying Learjets and Bach 111s, Hawker Siddeley's, all kinds of aircraft, very talented pilot. And he leveled off and just inexplicably flew into some power lines, got caught up, tilted down, fell to the earth, and died just about instantly. May 1988, leadership of the family once again is decapitated, and it was only a few months later that Osama, restless with his own ambitions, formed al-Qaeda formally at meetings in Peshawar. So I'll just conclude very briefly by reflecting a little bit on Osama in this light, and particularly ask the question, in what way is Osama himself an expression of his membership in the Bin Laden family? In other words, what are the characteristics that can be attributed to his to inspiration or example or learning or other experience that he had as a member of his own family? And I think I would just list four very briefly. One, his ability to lead diversity. I think Osama bin Laden is particularly talented, and actually al-Qaeda is a distinctive success among Islamist organizations and even among terrorist organizations writ larger, to include secular leftist organizations, in its ability to attract and hold such a diverse following. Al-Qaeda's followers are not just Saudis, they're not just Egyptians and Yemenis, they're not just Arabs from Palestine and Lebanon and Libya and Algeria. They're also Filipinos and Indonesians and Bangladeshis and Indians and Pakistanis and Afghans and Africans and Americans and Europeans. And this example of diversity unified in the name of Islam in pursuit of a kind of imagined community is certainly present in Osama's boyhood in the example of Mecca. After all, the Hajj is such an event where Islam's diversity is unified in an annual ritual. But so was Mohammed bin Laden's company such an example. Mohammed bin Laden's workforce organized in these desert camps when Osama and his brothers were boys was remarkable for its diversity. It wasn't just, there were very few indigenous Saudi laborers, so there were Yemenis and Palestinians and many from all over the Arab world, also from all over Africa. And then the executive ranks and the engineering ranks were from all over Europe. And Mohammed had this gift for leading and organizing such a diverse crew. I see his inspiration in Osama's own talent, and also in his attitude, his ability to sincerely convey no discrimination on the basis of language, national origin, or race. I think a second aspect of Osama's talent that is traceable to his bin Ladenness is his embrace of modernization and the technologies of globalization. His innovations as a terrorist are directly connected to his recognition of the power of technologies that cross borders, that obliterate obstacles erected by states, his first great achievement using a satellite phone to attack 2 U.S. embassies simultaneously in Africa while never leaving Afghanistan, his embrace very early on of video and media, his anticipation. He didn't just use satellite television as it became dominant in the Arab world. He anticipated it. He was making viral, self-produced fundraising videos in the early 1980s, 20 years before YouTube. And he was a gadget hound, and this comfort with the technologies of modernization is clearly something that Solomon and many others around him and his family brought to him. Third, he was a marketer. He had a business sense all along. He was a junior executive in the Bin Laden companies. Part of what they did was market brands into Saudi Arabia. And what is Al-Qaeda but sort of a brand that he's created with a very self-conscious set of mechanisms and talents. And finally, though he's much more shy than either his father or his eldest brother, he's nonetheless a performer. And you can see this again and again in his role as the leader of Al-Qaeda. Peter has this amazing story, which I often retell in Osama Bin Laden. I know about the wedding that he staged for his son in Afghanistan in 2001, where he invited his mother and his stepbrother, but he also had a whole bunch of Taliban guests. And of course, the Taliban's attitude towards technology is completely different from his own. But like any father, he wanted the wedding videotaped. So he had a friend, an Al Jazeera cameraman, come, and he basically said to the guy, all right, I want a video of this, but hide it under your robes. Don't let any of my Taliban guests see you. And while the guy was videotaping, he stood up and he recited this rather sort of despicable poem celebrating his attack on the USS Coll a few months before. And when he was done, he comes off and he grabs his cameraman friend and says, come over here. They go and they kind of hide from the Taliban. They go inside. Osama grabs the guy's video cameras, flips up the viewer, rewinds, looks at his own performance and says, I really didn't do that very well. I'm going to do a second take. And then he goes back out and he does the poem again so that it looks better on the video. And so there's some line, I think, between that and Solomon and his performance of House of the Rising Sun in 7 languages. So thank you.
Well, I'm going to talk very briefly, just a few thoughts on Steve's book. The first thing to note is that Michiko, the New York Times book reviewer, who is, if she doesn't like your book is an instant non-bestseller, gave...
She doesn't like many books.
she doesn't like many books. She loves Steve's book, and she gave it a rave review appropriately. When Steve left the Washington Post to become a full-time writer at the New Yorker, I said to him, knowing that he was one of the most accomplished, if not the most accomplished journalist of his generation in this country, I said to him, I hope you don't write anything that I'm remotely interested in. And Steve says something very non-committal, and now he produces this. Anyway, luckily we're friends and colleagues, and anyway, I wanted to just try and a couple of themes that jumped out of Steve's presentation. I think it's important to notice that there was a certain conjunction of things that happened all at the same time when Mohammed bin Laden left Yemen for Saudi Arabia. He arrives in, and Steve can correct me if the dates here are off, he arrives in Saudi Arabia in 1929, 1930. The bin Laden family company is founded in 1931. The kingdom itself of Saudi Arabia, the third version of the kingdom of Saudi Arabia, is founded in 32, and Standard Oil signs its first contract with the Saudi kingdom for oil exploration 2 years later. So all these things happen at the same time. Mohammed bin Laden was, in a sense, quite lucky. He arrived in Saudi Arabia at exactly the right moment. Another theme that I think emerges out of Steve's book is the question of how, there's a constant question amongst academics about, who becomes a terrorist and why. Well, we have a controlled experiment here. Osama bin Laden has 53 sisters and brothers, none of whom chose to go into his line of business. And so making any kind of statements, in a sense, about who's likely to embark on a path of violence, it becomes very clear in the bin Laden family that this was kind of a rather unusual path. Osama bin Laden certainly had a number of siblings, some of whom were more religious than others, but no one else took up this violent path. And I think there's a quote in Steve's book from, I believe, somebody in the FBI who says, there are millions of bin Ladens on the planet, 99.9% of them aren't militants. And just take the contrast between Osama bin Laden and Osama bin Laden, you realize how different families, the same family can produce two very different outcomes. One thing, by the way, Steve, I think in the crash, in Mohammed bin Laden's crash, the pilot, of course, was American, and one of the themes of Steve's book is the extent to which aviation, the death of both his brother, the most important brother, and also the father, took place in plane crashes, and then, of course, you have 9/11, and it's hard to make it's very hard to psychologize about Osama bin Laden because we don't really know what he thinks, but clearly the role of aviation crashes have played such an important role in his life. I'm glad Steve mentioned the fact that Mohammed bin Laden had a house in Jerusalem, because I think it's been kind of common wisdom that Osama bin Laden grabbed onto the Israeli-Palestinian issue late in the game. In fact, Sandy Berger wrote a chapter in a book to this effect. I think this is completely wrong. Bin Laden is a very religious, he was a very religious teenager. And if you go back to the 96 fatwa, where he first declared war against the United States, he says, "I feel the loss of Al-Quds in my intestines," the loss of the mosque in eastern Jerusalem in 1967. That's a pretty strong statement, in my view, and I think Steve's book confirms this. This is a family with long interests in Jerusalem and a very strong interest in this question. One other point coming out of the death of Osama bin Laden in May 1988, as Steve pointed out, a few months later Al-Qaeda is founded. If Salam had still been around, I think certainly people that know Osama that I talked to said that the one person that could have got bin Laden not to go ahead with this Al-Qaeda project would have been Salam bin Laden, who would have just gone over to Pakistan and dragged him back to Saudi Arabia by the scruff of his neck. But with the death of his older brother, there really wasn't anybody in the family with the kind of authority that could stop him. And one final thought. There's been a debate about how organized Al-Qaeda has been. We've got a new book by Mark Sageman, who spoke here a few weeks ago, called Leaderless Jihad. Jason Burke, who's written a book about Al-Qaeda, saying Al-Qaeda is really something that was dreamt up by American prosecutors in the U.S. embassy trial as a way of sort of producing an organization which they could prosecute, just as they prosecuted mafia organizations in the past. One thing that I think emerges very clearly from Steve's book is the question of the organizational skills of the family. And of course, bin Laden, one of bin Laden's aliases was the director. He studied economics and public administration at the University of at King Abdulaziz University in Jeddah. He founded Al-Qaeda with multiple business committees, multiple committees, military, business, media, and religion. And we know since the fall of the Taliban that Al-Qaeda had application forms to join the group. They had vacation policies, slightly more generous than the vacation policy I enjoy in CNN. And this was a highly organized group. I don't think that's an accident, as Steve has pointed out. This is somebody who came from one of the largest businesses in the Middle East, who spent a fair amount of time working in this business. And the fact that he organized Al-Qaeda in quite an organized manner, I don't think is particularly surprising. So with that, we'll open it to Q&A.
Thank you very much, Peter. Let me ask you, well, we can take questions to both, but let me sort of pose both a reaction and a question to Steve Coll, if I may, real quickly. I just got back, a number of us from the New American Foundation went to Saudi Arabia, and Steve's book came out literally 3 or 4 days before our departure, and so the book itself.
You're going to be in prison.
Yeah, I was worried about this and didn't quite understand. There was a lot of excitement in some quarters of Saudi Arabia about the book, and some trepidation. But since no one had read it, they asked me what I thought, and I decided not to read it before I went to keep myself, in case of being questioned. But I mean, the really interesting question is, to what degree is it legitimate? And I think it is legitimate, but to look at Saudi Arabia through the prism of bin Laden. I think Steve has pulled off a very interesting trick, a good trick in this, because we as Americans have been forced to think about Saudi Arabia because of bin Laden and 9/11. We should have been thinking about it more broadly before it. We may need to ask the question of why weren't we? I was at a dinner last night with the chairman and CEO of Saudi Aramco, and I was told in no uncertain terms that this dinner for 400 people at the Library of Congress was off the record. It's impossible to do that at the Library of Congress, but it gave one a sense that this magnificent dinner, and frankly a very impressive speech, that there's a lack of interest in being known at some level in Saudi Arabia that made, to some degree, the prism of looking at Saudi Arabia through the prism of terrorism, and thus through the Bin Laden family. But then Steve brings it around to look at this tremendous diversity and modernity expressed in this family, which also is a very vital part of the Saudi society. And I saw that in Saudi Arabia. I saw a lot more modernity and a lot more liberalism than I had anticipated or expected. And I'm interested from Steve, is that how you sort of thought you were telling the story, that we have had a distorted view of Saudi Arabia, misunderstood Saudi Arabia, or didn't look and neglected Saudi Arabia, and in fact we've been forced to look at Bin Laden and terrorism because of the shock of 9/11, and what you've tried to do is leaven that out somewhat and show the diversity and scope, and it's really the sort of a broader, Saudi expose. And just one last piece, I think this is important. The other thing that came up when I was over there, when I asked people specifically about Bin Laden, is the number of Saudis who blame Egypt for him. They said he, of course, is a Saudi Arabian citizen, but he doesn't, the DNA that sent him off on the course was an Egyptian derivative, not derivative of any of the battle between modernity and terrorism and whatnot in Saudi Arabia. I'm interested in how the Egypt piece of this fits, if at all.
Well, I didn't enter into this project for the purposes of demonstrating one thing or another. I wanted to just try to break through some of the barriers to research and writing about Saudi Arabia that the Saudis themselves erect, as your dinner ground rules suggest. This is the hardest place in the world I've ever worked, and I've worked a lot of places, and it's a place apart because it doesn't have the points of entry that a researcher, an honest-minded empirical researcher, normally relies upon. So you don't have really a free press in Saudi Arabia. You have some journalists, some of whom have various degrees of independent mindedness, but really very constrained. You don't have a political opposition. You don't have political discourse. You don't have free scholarship. You don't have human rights groups to speak of. You have people who are attempting to create these things now, but in a very pressured environment. And so I think that it is a difficult environment to try to humanize and to make authentic and specific. And my objective was to try to be specific, because so many of the ways in which we see Saudi Arabia have been shaped by cliches. The political cartoons dating back to the 1970s of the long-chinned, sort of man pouring gasoline into our big-finned American cars. And of course Saudi Arabia is full of diversity and full of interest, but as a researcher, being able to describe that is a challenge. And that, I guess that was one of my objectives, was just to try to be more sort of specific about Saudi experience through, as Peter put it, the controlled experiment of a particular generation of a particular family that happened to include somebody who changed the course of history, but who also was surrounded by others who followed very different paths simultaneously, and yet they were bound together by a great sense of belonging. For all of their diversity, they were always Bin Ladens in a very powerful way. And of course, the family is the most important unit of politics in the Arabian Peninsula. As to the Egyptians, I think there's both truth and Saudi defensiveness in this line of argument. Saudi defensiveness, of course, because it would be very convenient if the world would just recognize that they weren't responsible at all for any of the theological and political views that Osama holds. But truth because from the very beginning at his prep school where Osama was radicalized, he attended a day school in Jeddah, the only one at the time. Shortly after his father's death, he enrolled there. The only one at the time that aspired to international standards. The curriculum was set up by Brits. The boys assembled in blue blazers and gray flannel slacks each morning, and the teachers included Englishmen and Irishmen, as well as Syrians and Egyptians. And the teachers from Syria and Egypt were members of the Muslim Brotherhood. by and large. And that was an anti-colonial, Egyptian-rooted, is an anti-colonial, Egyptian-rooted international Islamist movement with both proselytizing and violent aspects. Hamas is essentially the Brotherhood today in Palestine, for example. And Osama's physical education teacher, a Syrian who was an exiled member of the Brotherhood, indoctrinated him and a few other elite boys into a study group and essentially led Osama to become a brother. And so he was not politicized by the Saudi religious establishment exclusively, though that was also an influence upon him. But he was politicized to a considerable extent by these exiled members of the Brotherhood. And then once he got to Afghanistan, he connected to other members of Egyptian Brotherhood-derived radical factions with similar kinds of teaching. So that's the basis for the Saudi argument. It's rooted in truth, but it's not. It's by no means an exclusive explanation of the course of Osama's radicalization over the whole of the 20 years.
Thank you. Let me open the floor now. Yes, sir.
Now, Steve and Peter, what do you account for us?
And if you can identify yourself.
Don Wilson.
Don Wilson.
What do you account for us not having brought Bin Laden to justice? Number one. What do you account for the staggering silence about this? And what prospects do we have of ever bringing him to justice?
Okay, why haven't we brought Osama to justice? Donald Rumsfeld was asked the same question some years back, and he said the world's a big place, and that's actually true. I mean, we know where Bin Laden is. We almost certainly in the northwest frontier province of Pakistan. That's like saying I know somebody's in Virginia. It's not a particularly helpful sort of set of directions to find somebody. So, 40,000 square miles. Some of the most inhospitable terrain in the world. Bin Laden, you usually catch people three ways. One is signals intelligence. Bin Laden isn't talking on a cell phone or sat phone. Somebody drops a dime on you to catch it, to get a reward. The people in his circle aren't motivated by money, or you make a mistake. Human beings make mistakes. It's inevitable Bin Laden will make a mistake, and he's in an interesting catch-22. He can say nothing and become an historical figure, or he can continues to say something, and he opens himself to detection, because every time a tape is released, a courier has to take it somewhere, whether it's Al Jazeera's bureau or whether it's an internet website. What are the likelihood that we'll find him in the next several years? I think the likelihood is actually extremely low. Will we find him in the next 20 years? It's plausible. Bin Laden is 50 this year. Now that I'm 45, I think of that as being a relatively young man. He's not going to die of natural causes anytime soon, and unfortunately he's going to be around influencing what happens in the world jihadist movement for the foreseeable future.
Okay. Other questions? Yes, Diane?
Thank you. First of all, Diane Perlman, I just realized it's 20 years since his brother's death, May of '88, so I don't know if that means anything. I heard that his mother was sort of humiliated or in a lesser position and exiled, and as we learned from Reverend Wright last week, you don't say nothing bad about my mama or the dozens. So I wonder, what you know about that, and if any, the humiliation might have had an effect on him.
Yeah, it's. I don't think so, but there was a psychological environment surrounding his childhood that was intense and interesting, but maybe in a different way. His mother was a child, 14 or 15 years old, member of a very poor family in coastal Syria, when her family, for reasons that are not entirely clear but appear to be influenced by transactional factors of some sort, perhaps the promise of employment for sons and brothers, perhaps other considerations, handed her at 15 as a prospective wife to the traveling businessman Mohammad Bin Laden, who was perhaps 3 times her age when they were joined. She followed him, became pregnant with Osama, and then was divorced by him about a year or so after Osama's birth. Now, as I said, this was not an unusual narrative in Mohammed bin Laden's life, and he did recognize her as a legitimate wife, and he enfranchised Osama as a fully legitimate son. In fact, he was even more enfranchised in the family business, as it turned out, than some of his brothers, I assume by choice that he made as he grew up. But after the divorce, Mohammed bin Laden arranged for her remarriage to a mid-level executive in his own company. And she then entered into what became a monogamous union with this new husband, Osama's stepfather. And Osama moved with his mother into this stepfamily, And this monogamous union produced 3 or 4 children, 4 children, I think, 3 brothers and a sister, at least maybe another sister. And they lived in a fairly suburban, ordinary, in a Saudi context, step family, but nuclear household with a television playing Bonanza and family serials from the United States. And so, but what's Osama's status in this family? He enters with this teenaged bride who has been essentially passed from one man to another, with her son as essentially the source of all of her wealth and privilege, because it was Osama's status as the legitimate heir of Mohammad that was the source of income in this new step family. He received hundreds of thousands of dollars a year in dividends beginning in his teens, and he was the source of access to the Bin Laden fortune. And so he had this kind of insider-outsider status in his own family, the golden child, very intense special relationship with his mother, an accommodating relationship with his very sweet-tempered, passive stepfather, by all accounts, but one that was also distant. So it's a very interesting portrait, but one that's not that of an outcast.
Okay. Other questions? Yes.
Maria Berliner. In a recent trip doing research on the tri-border area, I visited Foz de Iguazu and Ciudad del Este. And it's becoming part of the law of the TVA that Osama Bin Laden visited the Omar al-Khattab Mosque in Foz de Iguazu shortly before 9/11. I have not believed that for a moment. Have you found any record of this, that he was in Latin America trying to proselytize, particularly the TVA and Foz de Iguazu?
So the question for the camera is there any evidence that Osama bin Laden was in Latin America proselytizing a mosque before 9/11? Yeah, thank you.
No.
None. Other questions, comments? Yes.
Hi, Ron Burr. When you speak about special talents or natural talents of Bin Laden.
Feel free to use your lungs. More loudly if you
Well, okay,
could.
I'm sorry.
We don't have a
When you speak
microphone
to-
around the
When you
room,
speak
yeah.
to the natural talents of the main Bin Laden figures, to what extent is the U.S. interested in the affairs of Mohammed's grandchildren?
Interesting. So the question is really, to what degree is the United States interested in the affairs of the
Correct, or
grandchildren?
the U.S. government,
Yeah.
administration, what have you?
Well, Osama's sons are of interest because several of them remain in exile and seem to be affiliated with his cause. Though he wrote this will in the dark hours of December 2001, when he thought he was going to die or be captured, advising his children that they should not follow him into a life of exile and jihad. Nonetheless, in the period of recovery that he's enjoyed since then, it seems that several of his sons have remained committed in some respect to his cause, though in some cases it's not clear where they are, but some are out there, presumably in the Pak-Afghan border areas, at least 2 or 3. As to the rest of the Bin Ladens, no. I think actually the younger generation, which numbers well up over 100, of course, 54 children now, all in their 50s and 60s, virtually all of them have had families of their own now. Many of those children, some of those children were born in the United States when their parents were college students, have U.S. passports. They're generally more comfortable coming and going from the States. Osama's brothers and sisters have pretty much stayed away since 9/11, but the younger ones come around. And when I was lecturing on this book tour in London, some of them even turned up at LSE in the audience. So they're all over the place, and I think comfortable in a global environment.
Other questions? Yes.
Al Milliken, Washington Writers. Are there any of the Bin Ladens you would consider their religious devotion equating Osama's, and did their interpretation of Islam take any significantly different form?
Did any family members of Osama's or
Well,
the
any
Bin
of
Ladens take any?
I'm wondering if any of their religious devotion could be equated with Osama's.
Well, none of them entered into violence, but many of them were quite devoted to their faith and lived a creed of sort of Puritan interpretation of an Islamic life that was similar to Osama's during his teenage years. One of his sisters married his friend Jamal Khalifa at a time when they were both involved in the anti-Soviet phase of the Afghan war. A couple of his sisters are reckoned to be the ones who remained closest to him during the 80s at least and into the 90s. Some of his brothers are also very devoted to Islam in their lifestyles. And of course, like in the West, over the course of a lifetime, people's relationship with their faith changes. So some started out with very secular choices and then ended up coming back to an equally ardent devotion to Islam, living in Mecca and Medina. And so yes, it's in that 54. It's like there's a spectrum, and on Osama's side of the spectrum, he's not alone.
I want to pose just a follow-up question. I think, is there a mistake and sort of a myth that among, not bin Laden, but bin Laden's followers, that religion is a driver? When I was in Saudi Arabia, we were given access and a presentation on some fascinating empirical assessments and studies of terrorists, Al-Qaeda terrorists, and others that essentially the Saudi establishment had rolled up. And there were two primary studies. One which looked at essentially followers, the troops in the process, and others who were sort of ringleaders and really involved. And you could see very distinctive differences in everything from their housing, what family circumstances they had, their education levels, but it became very, and their religious devotion. And it was very clear that the jihadist crowd were those that were more religiously inspired. Then you look at the others, and it looks like any kind of complex social misfit that are more largely complex, brilliant thugs that are would be thugs in any system. And so one of the questions that I have in terms, and maybe this is as much to Peter as well, is that I think that this material is very true. It was accurate, it was true, but that must mean that bin Laden and Zawahiri, in the management of what they were doing, were bringing together with people who were not religious zealots in terms of the management and structure of what they're doing. And there were particularly 60 people in this various study, I think none of whom are alive any longer, but nonetheless, that the outcomes, the research that they did on these people are quite fascinating. So what kind of deals, personal deals, did Osama, Zawahiri, and others have to do to sort of animate? I mean, these are the top tier bad guys in Al-Qaeda who aren't religiously motivated.
Well, the Saudi data, the Saudis, like a lot of other governments, are looking at this question in a very kind of rigorous way, and they're seeing in the second generation of Al-Qaeda recruits in the kingdom that they're much less religious, they're much more criminal, they're not reading religious texts, they're reading detective novels and these kinds of things. So that is true, and that is also a phenomenon that, of course, we've seen in the West. Richard Reed was a small-time hood, Jose Padilla is a small-time hood. So at the lower levels, yes, the followers maybe not. They're just, if, in a different context, they would have joined, the Weather Underground or some other militant organization. But bin Laden, Ayman al-Zawahiri themselves, I mean, to say, people talk about the root causes of terrorism. This is not a particularly PC thing to say, but it needs to be said, which is, you can't, if bin Laden was here and you were asked him, what's this about? He would say it's about the defense of true Islam. Myself and my friend Ayman al-Zawahiri are part of Vanguard, actually fighting for the future of Islam, and they see themselves exclusively in religious terms. And when they release these statements with all the squiggly bits that we don't read, well, the squiggly bits, which are the quotes from the Quran, are actually what are the most important bits. For bin Laden, this is a religious war. And for the upper reaches of this organization, I think as a general principle, they see themselves as doing God's will, and if they didn't do this, that God would punish them. That was actually Jamal Khalifa, who Steve mentioned. When I asked Jamal Khalifa, what is Osama really doing here? Because Jamal Khalifa, who's now dead, he was killed in Madagascar last year. The key question, this is, Jamal Khalifa was Osama's best friend at university. He married Osama's closest sister. I asked him, what is it about Osama? What is he really doing? He said, and Jamal Khalifa said, he feels like he is doing God's will, and if he doesn't do what God is asking him to do, that he will be punished in the next life. And I thought that was the most accurate explanation of what is driving Osama. I think it's very hard to explain him otherwise.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think it's present in Osama's own writings and statements again and again and again. I mean, when he speaks to the West, he sometimes speaks about ripped from the headlines political subjects and can sound for a paragraph or two like a reassuringly familiar political dissident. And I think there's a tendency to overemphasize that aspect of his discourse because it is the most comprehensible, but to his Western listeners. But the fullness of his text emphasizes his millenarian ideas to an equal or greater extent. And it's not... it's a very specific calling that he describes himself drawn to, and it has a narrative arc that ends at the end of human time with Judgment Day, where all of true Islam will be called, and that he believes that his motivation is to draw his followers and as many Muslims to that righteous hour as he can, and that's the purpose of his vanguard. It's not to create a particular government that he wants to be prime minister of. It is. It has this very consistent millenarian narrative, and that's a kind of difficult thing for his Western audience sometimes to listen to or grasp, and you can mock him as in his last video statement when he essentially went through a whole litany of here and now political grievances and then calmly explained that the best response that American voters could undertake would not be to support this candidate or that, but for everyone simply to convert to Islam. I mean, that's really where he's coming from in his own narrative.
I guess the question is more he has no problem realizing that the character profile of those who are animating his agenda are essentially criminals.
Well, no, but he sees himself as a teacher and a religious teacher and a moral teacher, and of course, from the very beginning, not only in the second generation, he's had lots of people who are more politically motivated than religiously motivated, people who are thugs, who are more drawn to the glamour of violence and the summer camp atmosphere of a jihadi exercise. And it's been the role of Al-Qaeda to offer religious and moral instruction to these people and to draw them in.
Thank you. Kunio Kikuchi?
It's about the stature of Osama. Physical stature, as a short guy getting shorter every year. I noticed that I was told he's about 6'6" tall, 199 centimeters, and that would make him stand out. I think the Afghans are not very tall people. He's taller than Steve. So,
right.
What is your take on? Doesn't it make him easier to be found? One. And are there other brothers in the family that are also tall?
So did height matter?
I think he's not as tall as 6'6". I think our friend Larry Wright made a big point about insisting that he was 6'1", or 6'2". I don't know. I think that he's not. He's over 6 feet, but maybe not 6'6". But there are many Bin Laden brothers who are notably tall. Though his father wasn't particularly.
Yes.
My name is Don Dakin. Do you think that if he had access to a nuclear bomb, he would use it in an American city? Or is there something about him that you've learned that would restrain him in some way?
So if he had access to a nuclear bomb, would he use it? I know what Peter's going to say.
Well, the answer is yeah, of course. I mean, they've made it their doctrine that we're owed 4 million deaths, including children, 2 million children, because of our supposed crimes in the Muslim world. So, luckily, the likelihood of Al-Qaeda getting a nuclear device anytime in the next several decades, I think, is pretty low.
No, but how does the Muslim Brotherhood feel about Osama? Do we know?
Yeah, it depends on what brotherhood you're talking about, but generally, because now they're sort of, there's the Egyptians. The Egyptians have broken with EIJ, that Egyptian Islamic Jihad, which is Zawahiri and company's faction, and they have such a parochial sort of deathmatch struggle that I think that, it's not so much purely ideological as it is also personal and historical. The big difference between the Brotherhood generally and Al-Qaeda is that, first, the Brotherhood has at least a substantial proselytizing evolutionary idea of its political goals. And then secondly, its members tend, even when they are interested in expedient revolutionary objectives, they're interested in particular territory to a much greater extent than certainly the al-Qaeda that evolved after 1988 became much more of what interested in what the anthropologist Benedict Anderson labels the imagined community, although a faithful Muslim wouldn't regard it as imagined, but the imagined space, global space of Islamic lands, and it's extraterritorial.
Yes, sir.
Name's Colin Baber.
You're going to speak loudly.
Oh, sorry. Yes. Hi. Name's Colin Baber. Mr. Bergen, I've heard this story about how if the security service really wants to get at someone, they're going to get him, unless he has backing of another. Which organizations outside of Al-Qaeda would be helping keep Bin Laden alive?
Which security service would be helping to
Well,
keep
look,
Bin
I mean, it goes
alive?
back to, I mean, I'll give you 3 examples of why that doesn't necessarily make sense. Pablo Escobar, it was well known that Pablo Escobar lived in Medellin, and it took 2 years for massive Colombian military and CIA help to find him. Similarly, we knew that Mohammad was in Mogadishu. There were 20,000 American troops looking for him and 20,000 troops from other countries, and they never found him. So it's very hard to find somebody if they're not making mistakes. Is Bin Laden being helped by some security service? I don't think so. Is the Pakistani government unwilling or incapable of going after him? Possibly. But it's a hard target.
Steve?
Yeah, I think that there are a whole complicated set of incentives and motivations that have built up inside the Pakistani security services since 9/11 that have led to open admissions such as that by President Musharraf a couple of years ago that he stopped looking. And there are some in the European security services who believe that even for a while there was a kind of informal sense among both the Saudi and the Pakistani governments that stability and a kind of slow death of the hunt was better than a sudden disruptive capture or kill, and that may also have been a factor, but it wasn't in any sense a conspiracy more than just a set of attitudes and incentives that ran away from actually finding him.
Yes.
My name is Thomas Reid. In one of his last statements, Bin Laden did a couple of surprising things. He quoted Noam Chomsky. That was a speech he also mentioned. He said the Holocaust wouldn't have happened in the Islamic world. Things like that. He sounded basically like a globalization critic. Now, why is he doing this?
Well, I think he's got a lot of time on his hands. He's reading a lot of books. Globalization is a big subject in the books that he's reading. My own reading of him as someone who, like Peter, has spent way too many hours reading his own essays and pamphlets and statements is that this is not particularly where his talent lies, international political analysis. He has talents. I've tried to suggest some of them, and I don't mean to diss him by observing that this is perhaps not his strength. So he basically, one of his patterns is that he's very opportunistic about argument. So whatever is in the sort of water, he'll pick up and try to sort of pick up that vernacular and use it in his own pamphleteering. But yes, this was notable. His picking up on kind of criticisms of globalization and trying to adapt them to his own
yes, ma'am.
Essays.
Julia, hello. What impact has Bin Laden's notoriety in being a public enemy of the West had on the Bin Laden company? Is it business as usual for the Bin Laden company? And what impact has it had on the public standing of the Bin Laden family?
So the question is, what impact has Osama bin Laden had on the Bin Laden family's fortunes inside Saudi Arabia?
And on the family?
Well, I mean, obviously their name has acquired notoriety in Europe and the United States, where many of them previously had many relationships and connections. But in Saudi Arabia, they have not suffered for Osama's actions. They've not been punished by the Saudi royal family. Indeed, they've joined many other business families in prospering from the big infrastructure investments that the Saudi government is making off of $100 barrel oil. The most ironic of these contracts that I came across fairly recently was after al-Qaeda launched an aborted uprising in Saudi Arabia and the Saudi government cracked down, they let a very fast turnaround billion-dollar-plus contract to build more prisons in the kingdom, and the Bin Ladens won that contract. So they were working both sides of the of the revolution, in a sense. And but as to the kind of cultural environment that they've had to live in, you know, obviously one in which fear has been a dominant experience of being a bin Laden after 9/11, fear of American reaction, fear of when they were, so those who were in the United States, of vigilante attacks, but also fear of becoming a target of Al-Qaeda, of just kind of getting in the wrong crosshairs. And I think they've been caught between competing attitudes towards Osama, at least initially after 9/11. In much of Saudi Arabia, Osama was not reviled the way he was reviled by his victims. So in the first couple of years, he was seen as a kind of folk hero figure in sections of the kingdom, and bin Ladens were wary about alienating his supporters as much as they were wary about dealing with the reaction of his victims.
I want to bring this fascinating forum to a close so that Steve has time to sign some books for those who would like to get them. But I want to ask one final question. In your book, you highlight that the social contract between bin Laden and the Taliban was in part based upon bin Laden's ability to deliver money to keep the camps and keep training, and about $20 million a year as I read it. And so there was a financial aspect to this. When you look at the turf today, you see Iran, for instance, playing both sides of Afghanistan, helping to support the Taliban on one side, also funding Karzai's government and Karzai's needs. And it raises the question, two parts. One, is bin Laden having any, would you imagine it, what's the nature of bin Laden's contract now with the Taliban? And secondly, can you penetrate that relationship? Can the Iranians penetrate that relationship with creating alternative or conflicting dependencies? Because I wouldn't imagine that Iran and bin Laden would be great allies.
Well, I think the best estimate of the relationship between Al-Qaeda leadership and Taliban leadership on the Pakistan side of the Afghan-Pakistan border is one of distinct but accommodating leadership groups where aims sometimes overlap and sometimes diverge. That has been a pattern, broadly speaking, in the Al-Qaeda-Taliban relationship. My sense from talking to interlocutors with the militants in Pakistan is that both organizations jealously guard the independence of their leadership groups and their decision making, but they certainly are cooperating operationally in many ways. The Iranians are because of the sectarian divide in Pakistan, the Iranians have a very complicated hand to play in the area where bin Laden presumably is hiding. Their access to Afghanistan is considerably greater, but I think there is a potential in the next couple or 3 years for the divergence of the Pakistani government's interests vis-a-vis the Taliban and Al-Qaeda to create a lever that makes Al-Qaeda vulnerable, because the Pakistan government's interests now in the Pak-Afghan equation are to make as many portions of the Taliban pacified and politically legitimate as possible. And for as long as the Taliban are collaborating with Al-Qaeda, that is going to be a difficult project. So I do see Pakistani motivations now finally shifting in pragmatic ways towards seeing rewards for tearing down Al-Qaeda in a way that they didn't see rewards for a few years ago.
Peter, do you have any closing comments? Well, I want to thank both of you. We've had I think this is a fascinating discussion with two of the most important chroniclers of bin Laden and Al-Qaeda terrorism and this region. And I want to thank Steve, I want to thank Peter for sharing the time with us and working through the book. So let's give them all a round of applause. And then, Steve, to